vast expanse of the Russian countryside, where endless fields of grain stretch toward distant horizons and ancient birch forests whisper secrets of centuries past, stands an estate that has become synonymous with one of literature's most towering figures. Yasnaya Polyana, meaning clear glade, was more than just the ancestral home of Count Leo Tolstoy. It was the crucible in which one of humanity's greatest writers and most radical thinkers was forged. Here, amid the rolling hills of the Tula province, a man was born who would challenge not only the conventions of literature, but the very foundations of society, religion, and human existence itself. On September 9, 1828, in the grand manor house of Yasnaya Polyana, a child was born who would grow up to question everything his birthright represented. Count Lev Nikolaevich Tolstoy entered the world as the fourth of 5 children in one of Russia's most distinguished noble families, inheriting not only vast estates and serfs, but also a legacy that stretched back centuries into the heart of Russian aristocracy. The Tolstoy family traced their lineage to a mythical ancestor named Indris, who allegedly arrived from the lands of Caesar in 1353. Though the more documented history of the family began with Pyotr Tolstoy, who was granted the title of Count by Peter the Great in recognition of his diplomatic services. The Russia into which Leo Tolstoy was born was a land of stark contrasts and simmering tensions. The vast empire stretched from the Baltic Sea to the Pacific Ocean, encompassing dozens of ethnic groups and languages under the autocratic rule of Tsar Nicholas I. It was a society built on the foundation of serfdom, where millions of peasants were bound to the land and to their noble masters in a system that differed little from slavery. The aristocracy, numbering perhaps 1% of the population, owned the vast majority of the land and wielded absolute power over the lives of their serfs. Into this world of privilege and inequality, Leo Tolstoy was born with every advantage that Russian society could bestow. His father, Count Nikolai Ilyich Tolstoy, was a veteran of the Patriotic War of 1812. That great conflict in which Russia had turned back Napoleon's invasion and emerged as one of Europe's dominant powers. Nikolai embodied the ideals of his class. He was cultured, well-educated, and devoted to the service of the Tsar. He had served with distinction in the war that had defined his generation, and he managed his estates with the paternalistic benevolence that the best of the Russian nobility considered their duty toward their serfs. His marriage to Princess Maria Volkonskaya united 2 of Russia's most prominent noble families, creating a household that represented the pinnacle of aristocratic society. Princess Maria, Leo's mother, brought to the marriage not only her own distinguished lineage, but also a sensitivity and intelligence that would profoundly influence her children. The Volkonsky family had long been known for their cultural refinement and their interest in literature and the arts. Maria herself was well educated and possessed a deep appreciation for literature and music that she sought to instill in her children. She was also known for her charitable works among the peasants of the estate, demonstrating a concern for the welfare of the serfs that was perhaps unusual among her class but would prove to be a significant influence on her son's later development. The Yasnaya Polyana of Leo's childhood was a world unto itself, a microcosm of Russian society with its complex hierarchies and relationships. The estate encompassed thousands of acres of fertile farmland, forests, and meadows, supporting not only the Tolstoy family but also hundreds of serf families who worked the land and served in the household. The manor house itself was a substantial wooden structure, built in the classical style favored by the Russian nobility, with spacious rooms filled with books, paintings, and the accumulated treasures of generations. It was a place where French was spoken as readily as Russian, where European tutors educated the children alongside Russian teachers, and where the latest books and periodicals from Moscow and St. Petersburg arrived regularly to keep the family connected to the intellectual currents of their time. Yet this idyllic world was shattered early in Leo's life by tragedies that would profoundly shape his character and worldview. When he was barely 2 years old, his mother died, leaving behind 5 young children and a grief-stricken husband. The loss of Princess Maria was devastating not only for the immediate family but for the entire estate community, as she had been beloved by the serfs for her kindness and concern for their welfare. For young Leo, the loss of his mother at such a tender age created a void that would never be completely filled, contributing to a lifelong search for meaning and connection that would drive much of his later spiritual quest. The tragedy was compounded 7 years later when Leo's father also died, leaving the children orphaned at ages ranging from 9 to 16. Leo, at 9 years old, was particularly vulnerable to this second devastating loss. The death of Count Nikolai meant not only the loss of a father, but also the disruption of the stable world that had defined Leo's early childhood. The children were placed under the guardianship of relatives, first their father's sister, Alexandra Osten-Sarkin, and later their father's cousin, Tatiana Ergolskaya, both of whom did their best to provide the love and guidance that the orphaned children needed. These early losses had a profound impact on Leo's developing personality and worldview. The experience of losing both parents before the age of 10 created in him a deep sensitivity to suffering and mortality that would later find expression in his literature and philosophy. It also fostered a sense of independence and self-reliance that would characterize his entire life. Unlike many children of his class, who grew up secure in their position and expectations, Leo learned early that life was uncertain and that the comfortable assumptions of aristocratic existence could be shattered without warning. The guardianship arrangements also exposed Leo to different perspectives and influences within his extended family. Alexandra Osten-Sarkin was a woman of strong religious convictions who sought to instill in the children a deep faith in Orthodox Christianity. Tatiana Ergolskaya, on the other hand, was more liberal in her outlook and encouraged the children's intellectual development and questioning spirit. These contrasting influences contributed to the complex and sometimes contradictory nature of Leo's later development, as he struggled throughout his life to reconcile his spiritual longings with his rational skepticism. Despite the tragedies of his early years, Leo's childhood at Yasnaya Poliana was not without its joys and formative experiences. The estate provided an ideal environment for a curious and energetic child to explore and learn. He roamed the forests and fields, observed the changing seasons, and developed a deep love for the natural world that would remain with him throughout his life. He also had ample opportunity to observe the lives of the serfs who worked the estate, gaining insights into their struggles, hopes, and humanity that would later inform his social consciousness and his literary portrayals of peasant life. The educational arrangements for the Tolstoy children reflected the cosmopolitan nature of Russian aristocratic culture. They were taught by a succession of tutors, both Russian and foreign, who provided instruction in languages, literature, history, mathematics, and the arts. Leo proved to be a bright but sometimes difficult student, showing particular aptitude for languages and literature, while struggling with subjects that required rote memorization or strict discipline. His teachers noted his intelligence and creativity, but also his tendency toward independence and his resistance to authority, traits that would characterize his entire life. One of the most significant influences during Leo's childhood was his relationship with his older brothers, particularly Nikolai, who was 4 years his senior. Nikolai possessed a gentle and philosophical nature that complemented Leo's more passionate and impulsive temperament. The brothers shared a love of literature and ideas, and their conversations and shared reading helped to shape Leo's intellectual development. Nikolai also introduced Leo to some of the moral and philosophical questions that would later become central to his thinking, including questions about the nature of goodness, the meaning of life, and the proper way to treat other human beings. The world of Yasnaya Poliana in the 1830s and early 1840s was also shaped by the broader currents of Russian intellectual and cultural life. This was the era of the great flowering of Russian literature, when writers like Alexander Pushkin and Mikhail Lermontov were creating works that would define Russian literary culture for generations to come. The Tolstoy household was well connected to these intellectual currents, receiving the latest books and periodicals and hosting visitors who brought news and ideas from the capitals. This exposure to the broader world of Russian culture helped to nurture Leo's literary interests and ambitions, even as his personal experiences of loss and questioning prepared him for the deeper explorations of human nature that would characterize his mature work. As Leo approached adolescence, the contradictions and tensions that would define his later life were already beginning to emerge. He was simultaneously attracted to the privileges and pleasures of aristocratic life and troubled by the inequalities and injustices that he observed around him. He enjoyed the intellectual stimulation and cultural refinement of his class, while feeling increasingly uncomfortable with the system of serfdom that made such refinement possible. He was drawn to the orthodox faith of his childhood while beginning to question some of its teachings and practices. These early tensions would eventually drive him to seek answers in literature, philosophy, and ultimately in a radical transformation of his entire way of life. The childhood years at Yasnaya Polyana thus provided Leo Tolstoy with both the foundation and the contradictions that would shape his extraordinary life. The estate gave him a deep connection to the Russian land and people, a love of literature and learning, and an appreciation for the beauty and complexity of human existence. At the same time, the early losses he experienced and the social inequalities he observed planted the seeds of the moral questioning and spiritual searching that would eventually lead him to reject much of what his birthright represented. In the comfortable world of Russian aristocracy, a future revolutionary was being formed, though neither he nor anyone around him could have predicted the remarkable journey that lay ahead. In 1844, at the age of 16, Leo Tolstoy left the familiar world of Yasnaya Polyana to begin his university education at Kazan University, one of Russia's most prestigious institutions of higher learning. The transition from the intimate, family-centered environment of his childhood estate to the formal academic world of the university proved to be both challenging and transformative. Kazan, located on the Volga River in what was then considered the eastern frontier of European Russia, was a cosmopolitan city that served as a gateway between the Russian heartland and the vast territories of Central Asia. The university itself had been founded in 1804 as part of Tsar Alexander I's educational reforms, and had quickly established itself as a center of learning that attracted students from across the empire. Leo initially enrolled in the Faculty of Oriental Languages, a choice that reflected both his intellectual curiosity and his family's expectations that he might pursue a career in the diplomatic service. The study of Oriental languages, Arabic, Turkish, and Persian, was considered particularly valuable for young nobles who might serve the empire in its dealings with the Ottoman Empire and the various Muslim peoples within Russia's borders. However, Leo's academic performance from the very beginning suggested that he was not well suited to the conventional demands of university education. His professors described him as both unable and unwilling to learn, a harsh assessment that reflected not a lack of intelligence, but rather a fundamental mismatch between his learning style and the pedagogical methods of the time. The university system of the 1840s relied heavily on rote memorization, formal lectures, and strict adherence to prescribed curricula. Students were expected to absorb and regurgitate information rather than to question, analyze, or synthesize ideas in original ways. For a young man of Leo's temperament, curious, independent-minded, and already inclined toward philosophical questioning, this approach to education was stifling and counterproductive. He found himself increasingly frustrated with what he perceived as the meaningless accumulation of facts and the absence of any deeper engagement with the fundamental questions that interested him. Leo's difficulties were compounded by his social situation at the university. As a member of one of Russia's most prominent noble families, he occupied a position of privilege that set him apart from many of his fellow students. While this status brought certain advantages, better accommodations, social connections, and the respect of his professors, it also created a sense of isolation and alienation. Leo was acutely aware of the inequalities that defined Russian society, and his university experience only heightened his consciousness of the arbitrary nature of social hierarchies. He observed the struggles of less privileged students and began to question the justice of a system that provided opportunities based on birth rather than merit or need. After struggling through his first year in Oriental languages, Leo transferred to the law faculty, hoping that a different field of study might prove more engaging. Law was considered a practical and prestigious course of study for young nobles, offering preparation for careers in government service or estate management. However, the change of faculty did little to improve Leo's academic performance or his satisfaction with university life. The study of law, as it was taught at Kazan, was largely a matter of memorizing codes and precedents, rather than engaging with questions of justice, morality, or social reform. For a young man who was already beginning to grapple with fundamental questions about right and wrong, the mechanical approach to legal education was deeply unsatisfying. During his university years, Leo began to develop the habits of self-reflection and moral examination that would characterize his entire life. He started keeping a diary, a practice he would continue for decades, in which he recorded not only the events of his daily life, but also his thoughts, feelings, and moral struggles. These early diary entries reveal a young man who was already unusually introspective and self-critical, constantly examining his motives and behavior and finding himself wanting. He set ambitious goals for self-improvement, only to become frustrated when he failed to live up to his own high standards. This pattern of moral striving, followed by self-recrimination, would become a defining feature of his personality and would later find expression in the psychological complexity of his literary characters. The social life of the university also presented Leo with new challenges and temptations. Kazan was a lively city with a vibrant social scene, and young nobles like Leo had access to balls, parties, and other entertainments that were largely closed to students from less privileged backgrounds. Leo found himself torn between his desire to participate in these social activities and his growing sense that such pursuits were frivolous and morally questionable. He was particularly troubled by the gambling that was common among his social circle, recognizing, even at a young age, that he had a dangerous susceptibility to this vice. Leo's gambling began as a social activity, a way to fit in with his peers and to experience the excitement and camaraderie of the gaming tables. However, it quickly became something more serious and troubling. He discovered that he had both a talent for cards and a dangerous inability to control his betting. The thrill of risk and the possibility of dramatic wins appealed to something deep in his nature, but the inevitable losses that followed created cycles of guilt, debt, and desperation that would plague him for years to come. His gambling debts during his university years were substantial enough to require assistance from his family, creating the first of many financial crises that would result from his inability to control this destructive habit. The intellectual atmosphere of Kazan University in the 1840s was shaped by the broader currents of Russian thought and the political climate of Nicholas I's reign. This was an era of strict censorship and political repression, when the government sought to control not only what was published, but also what was taught in universities and discussed in intellectual circles. The Decembrist uprising of 1825, in which a group of noble officers had attempted to prevent Nicholas I's succession to the throne and to establish a constitutional monarchy, had created a climate of suspicion and fear that affected all aspects of Russian intellectual life. University professors were required to adhere to approved curricula and to avoid any discussions that might be construed as politically subversive. Despite these restrictions, or perhaps because of them, Leo and his fellow students were intensely interested in the philosophical and political questions that were transforming European thought. The ideas of German philosophers like Kant, Hegel, and Schelling were beginning to penetrate Russian intellectual circles, along with the social theories of French thinkers like Saint-Simon and Fourier. These new ideas offered alternative ways of understanding society, history, and human nature that challenged the traditional assumptions of Russian autocracy and Orthodox Christianity. For young intellectuals like Leo, exposure to these ideas was both exciting and disturbing, opening up new possibilities for thought while creating doubts about the foundations of their own society. Leo's reading during his university years extended far beyond his official coursework and reflected his growing interest in literature, philosophy, and moral questions. He was particularly drawn to the works of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, whose Confessions and Émile offered a radical critique of civilization and a vision of natural goodness that resonated with Leo's own growing discomfort with the artificialities of aristocratic society. Rousseau's emphasis on the corrupting influence of social institutions and his belief in the fundamental goodness of human nature would remain important influences throughout Leo's life, shaping both his literary work and his later philosophical development. The influence of Rousseau was complemented by Leo's reading of other Enlightenment thinkers, including Voltaire, whose skepticism toward organized religion and social conventions appealed to Leo's questioning nature. He also discovered the works of English and German philosophers, including David Hume and Immanuel Kant, whose rigorous approaches to questions of knowledge and morality provided intellectual frameworks for his own developing thoughts. This broad and eclectic reading program, pursued largely outside the formal requirements of his university education, was perhaps more important to Leo's intellectual development than anything he learned in his official coursework. As Leo's dissatisfaction with university life grew, he began to consider alternatives to the conventional path that was expected of him. The idea of leaving the university and returning to Yasnaya Polyana to manage his estates became increasingly attractive, not only as an escape from academic frustrations, but also as an opportunity to put some of his developing ideas about social reform into practice. He was particularly interested in the possibility of improving the conditions of the serfs on his estates, an interest that reflected both his growing social consciousness and his exposure to Enlightenment ideas about human dignity and natural rights. In 1847, after 3 years of increasingly unsatisfactory academic performance, Leo made the decision to leave Kazan University without completing his degree. This decision was seen by his family and professors as a failure, a waste of his talents and opportunities. However, for Leo himself, it represented a first assertion of independence and a rejection of conventional expectations that would characterize his entire life. He had concluded that the formal education offered by the university was not providing him with the knowledge and understanding he sought, and he was determined to pursue his own path of learning and development. The decision to leave university was also influenced by practical considerations, particularly the need to address the financial problems created by his gambling debts and the deteriorating condition of his estates. As the heir to Yasnaya Polyana and other family properties, Leo had responsibilities that could not be indefinitely postponed. The management of large estates with hundreds of serfs required attention and skill, and Leo was beginning to understand that his future lay not in government service or academic pursuits, but in the practical challenges of rural life and estate management. Leo's departure from Kazan University marked the end of his formal education, but the beginning of a more intensive period of self-education and moral development. He returned to Yasnaya Polyana with a head full of ideas and ideals, but with little practical experience of how to implement them. The next few years would test his resolve and his ability to translate his philosophical convictions into concrete action, while also providing him with the experiences and insights that would eventually find expression in his literary work. The university years had been a time of intellectual awakening and moral questioning for Leo Tolstoy, even if they had not provided him with the formal credentials that his family had hoped for. He had discovered his love of literature and philosophy, developed his capacity for self-reflection and moral analysis, and begun to question the assumptions and values of his social class. He had also encountered the temptations and challenges that would continue to test him throughout his life, including his susceptibility to gambling and his struggle to live up to his own moral standards. Most importantly, he had begun to develop the independence of thought and the willingness to challenge conventional wisdom that would eventually make him one of the most influential writers and thinkers of his age. The young man who returned to Yasnaya Polyana in 1847 was very different from the 16-year-old who had left for university 3 years earlier. He was more mature, more thoughtful, and more aware of the complexities and contradictions of the world around him. He was also more determined to find his own path and to live according to his own convictions, regardless of what others might expect or demand. The stage was set for the next phase of his development, in which he would attempt to put his ideals into practice while also beginning the literary career that would eventually make him famous around the world. The return to Yasnaya Polyana in 1847 marked the beginning of what Leo Tolstoy would later describe as one of the most dissolute and morally confused periods of his life. Free from the constraints of university life but not yet committed to any particular career or purpose, he divided his time between his estate and the social whirl of Moscow and St. Petersburg. In the capital cities, he threw himself into the pleasures available to a young man of his rank and fortune. Gambling, drinking, and the pursuit of romantic adventures that were as fleeting as they were unsatisfying. His gambling debts continued to mount, reaching levels that threatened the financial stability of his estates and caused considerable anxiety to his family and guardians. Yet even during this period of apparent dissipation, Leo was engaged in serious intellectual and literary pursuits that would prove crucial to his development as a writer. He continued his voracious reading, exploring works of literature, philosophy, and social theory that expanded his understanding of human nature and society. He also began his first serious attempts at writing, starting work on what would become his autobiographical novel, Childhood. This early literary effort was more than just a creative exercise. It was an attempt to understand and make sense of his own experiences and emotions, particularly the losses and traumas of his early years. The writing of Childhood represented a significant step in Leo's development as both an artist and a moral thinker. The process of recreating and analyzing his early experiences forced him to confront questions about memory, identity, and the nature of human development that would remain central to his work throughout his career. The novels focus on the inner life of a child, its attention to psychological detail, and its exploration of the relationship between individual experience and social environment marked it as something new and significant in Russian literature. However, by 1851, Leo's life had reached a crisis point. His gambling debts had become so severe that he was forced to sell part of the family estate to pay them, a humiliating acknowledgement of his inability to control his destructive habits. His attempts at estate management had been largely unsuccessful, hampered by his inexperience and his conflicted feelings about the system of serfdom that made his wealth possible. His romantic relationships had been unsatisfying and often painful, leaving him with a sense of emptiness and moral confusion. Most troubling of all, he was beginning to experience the kind of existential despair that would later drive his spiritual crisis, a sense that his life lacked meaning and purpose, despite all the advantages he had been given. It was at this low point that Leo's older brother Nikolai, who was serving as an artillery officer in the Caucasus, invited him to join the army and seek a fresh start in military service. The invitation came at exactly the right moment, offering Leo an escape from his debts, his social embarrassments, and his growing sense of moral failure. More importantly, It offered him the possibility of finding purpose and meaning through service to his country and exposure to the realities of life beyond the comfortable world of the Russian aristocracy. The Caucasus in the 1850s was Russia's most active military frontier, where the empire was engaged in a long and brutal campaign to subdue the mountain peoples who had resisted Russian rule for decades. The region was known for its spectacular natural beauty: towering snow-capped peaks, deep valleys, and rushing rivers, but also for the violence and hardship of frontier warfare. For young Russian officers, service in the Caucasus was seen as both an opportunity for advancement and a test of courage and character. The combination of danger, exotic landscapes, and the camaraderie of military life had a romantic appeal that attracted many of the most adventurous spirits of Leo's generation. Leo's initial experiences in the Caucasus were transformative in ways he had not anticipated. The natural beauty of the region made a profound impression on him, awakening a love of landscape and a sense of the sublime that would find expression throughout his literary work. The simplicity and authenticity of life on the frontier, stripped of the artificial conventions of aristocratic society, appealed to his growing desire for a more genuine and meaningful existence. Most importantly, his exposure to the mountain peoples of the region, Chechens, Circassians, and others, challenged his assumptions about civilization, culture, and human nature. The indigenous peoples of the Caucasus lived according to codes of honor and traditions that were very different from those of Russian society. Yet Leo found in them qualities of dignity, courage, and authenticity that he felt were often lacking in his own social class. Their resistance to Russian rule, while creating the military conflict in which he was participating, also commanded his respect and forced him to question the justice and morality of the imperial project. These encounters with different ways of life and different value systems would later influence his literary portrayals of non-Russian characters and his growing skepticism about the superiority of European civilization. Leo's military service also provided him with his first sustained exposure to the realities of violence and death. While the Caucasus campaign was not as intense as the major European wars of the period, it involved regular skirmishes, raids, and battles that brought Leo face to face with the brutal realities of armed conflict. He witnessed the death and wounding of comrades, participated in actions that resulted in the killing of enemy fighters, and experienced the fear, excitement, and moral confusion that combat produces in even the most thoughtful participants. These experiences with violence had a profound and lasting impact on Leo's moral development. While he proved to be a competent and courageous soldier, earning the respect of his fellow officers and the recognition of his superiors, he was deeply troubled by the human cost of warfare and the ease with which civilized men could be transformed into killers. The contradiction between the nobility and honor that military service was supposed to represent and the actual brutality and waste of war became a source of ongoing moral struggle that would eventually contribute to his conversion to pacifism. During his service in the Caucasus, Leo continued his literary work, completing Childhood and beginning work on its sequels, Boyhood and Youth. The success of Childhood, which was published in the prestigious journal The Contemporary in 1852, established Leo as a promising new voice in Russian literature and provided him with the encouragement he needed to continue his writing. The novel's psychological realism, its attention to the inner life of its characters, and its exploration of the relationship between individual development and social environment marked it as something new and significant in Russian literature. The literary success of Childhood was particularly meaningful to Leo because it represented the first time he had achieved something of lasting value through his own efforts, rather than through the advantages of his birth. The positive reception of the novel by critics and readers gave him a sense of purpose and direction that had been lacking in his life, and it began to suggest the possibility that literature might provide him with the meaningful career he had been seeking. In 1854, Leo's military career took a dramatic turn when he was transferred to the Crimean Peninsula to participate in the defense of Sevastopol against the Allied forces of Britain, France, and Turkey. The Crimean War represented the first major test of Russian military power since the Napoleonic Wars, and the siege of Sevastopol became the focal point of a conflict that would ultimately expose the weaknesses of the Russian Empire and force a reconsideration of many of its fundamental institutions. The siege of Sevastopol was one of the most brutal and prolonged military operations of the 19th century, lasting 11 months and resulting in enormous casualties on both sides. Leo served as an artillery officer in some of the most dangerous positions, including the famous 4th Bastion, which was under constant bombardment from enemy forces. His experiences during the siege provided him with an intimate knowledge of warfare that few writers have ever possessed, and they would later inform some of the most powerful and realistic battle scenes in world literature. The conditions during the siege were horrific, with soldiers on both sides suffering from disease, inadequate supplies, and the constant threat of death or mutilation. Leo witnessed scenes of heroism and cowardice, of suffering and endurance that challenged his romantic notions about war and glory. He saw how quickly the veneer of civilization could be stripped away under extreme conditions, and how ordinary men could display both extraordinary courage and shocking brutality when faced with mortal danger. Perhaps most importantly, the siege of Sevastopol gave Leo his first sustained exposure to the common soldiers of the Russian army, men who came from the peasant class and who bore the primary burden of the empire's military campaigns. He was struck by their courage, their endurance, and their simple patriotism, but also by their suffering and the casual indifference with which their lives were sacrificed by their officers and political leaders. These observations would later inform his literary portrayals of war and his growing conviction that the common people possessed a wisdom and authenticity that was often lacking in the educated classes. During the siege, Leo began work on his Sevastopol Sketches, a series of 3 stories that would establish his reputation as one of Russia's most important writers. These stories were remarkable for their unflinching realism, their psychological insight, and their refusal to romanticize or glorify warfare. Unlike most military literature of the period, which focused on heroic deeds and noble sacrifices, Leo's sketches portrayed war as it actually was: chaotic, brutal, and ultimately meaningless in human terms. The Sevastopol Sketches were also notable for their democratic spirit and their focus on the experiences of common soldiers rather than their officers. Leo's portraits of ordinary Russian soldiers were sympathetic and respectful, recognizing their humanity and dignity in ways that were unusual for literature of the period. This democratic impulse would become increasingly important in his later work and would contribute to his growing identification with the common people rather than with his own aristocratic class. The publication of the Sevastopol Sketches in The Contemporary created a sensation in Russian literary circles and established Leo as one of the most promising writers of his generation. The stories were praised for their realism, their psychological insight, and their moral seriousness, and they were seen as representing a new direction in Russian literature. More importantly for Leo himself, the success of the sketches confirmed his sense that literature could be a vehicle for exploring the most serious questions about human nature and society. The end of the Crimean War in 1856 marked a turning point, not only in Leo's personal development but also in the history of Russia itself. The defeat of Russian forces and the exposure of the empire's military and administrative weaknesses led to a period of reform and self-examination that would transform Russian society over the following decades. For Leo, the war had provided him with experiences and insights that would inform his writing for the rest of his career. But it had also raised troubling questions about violence, patriotism, and the nature of human civilization that would eventually lead him to reject warfare entirely. Leo's military service had transformed him from a dissolute young aristocrat into a serious writer and moral thinker. The experiences of the Caucasus and the Crimea had exposed him to different ways of life, different value systems, and different perspectives on the fundamental questions of human existence. They had also provided him with a store of experiences and observations that would enrich his literary work and give it a depth and authenticity that few writers could match. Perhaps most importantly, his military service had begun the process of moral questioning and spiritual searching that would eventually lead to his complete transformation in later life. The violence he had witnessed and participated in, the suffering he had observed, and the questions about justice and meaning that these experiences had raised would continue to trouble him long after he had left the army. The seeds of his later pacifism and his rejection of violence in all its forms had been planted during his years as a soldier, even though it would be decades before they would fully flower. When Leo left the army in 1856, he was a very different man from the one who had joined it 5 years earlier. He had proven his courage and competence as a soldier, established his reputation as a writer, and begun the process of moral and spiritual development that would define the rest of his life. He had also gained a perspective on Russian society and human nature that would inform all of his subsequent work and thinking. The stage was set for the next phase of his development, in which he would attempt to build on these foundations to create both a literary career and a way of life that would be worthy of the insights and convictions he had gained through his military experiences. The conclusion of the Crimean War in 1856 found Leo Tolstoy at a crossroads in his life. At 28, he had already achieved considerable recognition as a writer, with his Sevastopol sketches establishing him as one of the most promising voices in Russian literature. His military service had provided him with experiences and insights that set him apart from his literary contemporaries, most of whom had never witnessed the realities of warfare or lived among the common soldiers whose lives they attempted to portray. Yet despite these achievements, Leo felt restless and unsatisfied, uncertain about his future direction and troubled by questions about the meaning and purpose of his life. The Russia to which Leo returned from the Crimean War was a nation in the midst of profound transformation. The military defeat had exposed the fundamental weaknesses of the autocratic system and had forced Tsar Alexander II to embark on a program of reforms that would reshape Russian society. The most significant of these reforms was the abolition of serfdom, which was being actively debated in government circles and intellectual salons throughout the empire. For Leo, who had inherited hundreds of serfs with his estates and who had been troubled by the moral implications of human bondage since his youth, these discussions were of particular personal and moral significance. It was in this context of national soul-searching and personal uncertainty that Leo decided to undertake his first journey to Western Europe in 1857. The trip was motivated by several factors: a desire to broaden his intellectual and cultural horizons, an interest in observing European educational methods that might be applicable to Russia, and perhaps most importantly, a need to gain perspective on his own society and its problems by viewing them from the outside. Like many Russian intellectuals of his generation, Leo was deeply ambivalent about the relationship between Russia and Western Europe, simultaneously attracted to European ideas and institutions, and suspicious of their applicability to Russian conditions. Leo's first destination was Paris, the cultural capital of Europe and the center of the intellectual and artistic movements that were reshaping Western civilization. Paris in the 1850s was a city of extraordinary vitality and creativity, where writers like Victor Hugo and Charles Baudelaire were revolutionizing literature, where artists like Gustave Courbet were challenging traditional approaches to painting, and where social theorists like Pierre-Joseph Proudhon were developing new ideas about society and politics. For a young Russian writer seeking to understand the broader currents of European thought, Paris offered unparalleled opportunities for intellectual stimulation and cultural enrichment. However, Leo's experience in Paris was profoundly shaped by an event that occurred early in his visit and that would haunt him for the rest of his life. On the morning of April 6, 1857, he witnessed a public execution by guillotine, an experience that shocked him to his core and fundamentally altered his understanding of justice, civilization, and the nature of state power. The execution was that of a man who had been convicted of murder, and it was carried out according to the legal procedures of the French Republic, with all the formalities and safeguards that were supposed to distinguish civilized justice from barbaric revenge. Yet what Leo witnessed was not the triumph of justice, but what he perceived as a horrific act of state-sanctioned murder, carried out with a cold efficiency that was more disturbing than any crime of passion. The crowd that gathered to watch the execution displayed a bloodthirsty enthusiasm that appalled him, and the casual indifference of the officials who carried out the sentence seemed to him to represent the ultimate corruption of human values. In a letter to his friend Vasily Botkin, Leo wrote words that would prove prophetic of his later political philosophy. The truth is that the state is a conspiracy designed not only to exploit, but above all to corrupt its citizens. Henceforth, I shall never serve any government anywhere. This experience of witnessing state violence in its most naked form was a turning point in Leo's moral development. It forced him to confront questions about the legitimacy of government authority, the nature of justice, and the relationship between law and morality that would become central to his later thinking. The execution also crystallized his growing sense that there was something fundamentally wrong with a civilization that could carry out such acts in the name of justice and order. The seeds of his later anarchism and his rejection of all forms of state violence can be traced to this traumatic morning in Paris. The impact of the execution was intensified by the contrast between the brutality he had witnessed and the cultural refinement that surrounded him in Paris. Here was a city that prided itself on its civilization, its art, its literature, and its philosophy. Yet it could still engage in acts that seemed to Leo to be fundamentally barbaric. This contradiction between cultural achievement and moral failure would become a recurring theme in his thinking about European civilization, and would contribute to his growing skepticism about the value of progress as it was conventionally understood. Despite the trauma of the execution, Leo continued his European journey, traveling to Switzerland, Germany, and other countries to observe their educational systems and social institutions. He was particularly interested in the pedagogical methods being developed in Switzerland and Germany, where educators like Johann Pestalozzi and Friedrich Froebel were pioneering new approaches to childhood education that emphasized the natural development of the child rather than the imposition of external authority. These ideas resonated with Leo's own growing belief in the fundamental goodness of human nature and his skepticism about the corrupting influence of social institutions. Leo's observations of European educational methods would later influence his own experiments in education when he returned to Russia. He was struck by the contrast between the relatively humane and child-centered approaches he observed in Western Europe and the harsh, authoritarian methods that were common in Russian schools. This experience contributed to his growing conviction that education should be a process of liberation rather than indoctrination, and that children possessed an innate wisdom and goodness that should be nurtured rather than suppressed. His European journey also exposed Leo to new literary and philosophical influences that would shape his subsequent development as a writer and thinker. He met with leading European intellectuals and writers, including Ivan Turgenev, who was living in Paris at the time, and who introduced him to the broader currents of European literary culture. Through Turgenev and others, Leo was exposed to the works of contemporary European writers and philosophers who were grappling with many of the same questions that troubled him. Of particular importance was Leo's encounter with the works of Arthur Schopenhauer, the German philosopher whose pessimistic philosophy and emphasis on the will as the driving force of human existence resonated with Leo's own growing sense of the tragic nature of life. Schopenhauer's critique of conventional morality and his emphasis on compassion as the highest virtue would later influence Leo's own moral philosophy, even as he would ultimately reject Schopenhauer's pessimism in favor of a more hopeful vision of human possibility. Leo's second European journey, undertaken in 1860 to 1861, was even more significant for his intellectual and moral development. This trip was motivated primarily by his interest in educational reform and his desire to study European pedagogical methods more systematically. However, it also provided him with opportunities for deeper engagement with European intellectual life and for more sustained reflection on the questions that had been troubling him since his first journey. During this second trip, Leo spent considerable time in Germany, where he observed the educational methods being developed in various schools and institutions. He was particularly impressed by the emphasis on practical education and the integration of intellectual and manual training that he observed in some German schools. These observations would later influence his own educational experiments at Yasnaya Poliana, where he would attempt to create a school that combined intellectual development with practical skills and moral education. The second European journey also brought Leo into contact with Victor Hugo, the great French writer whose works had already influenced his thinking about literature and society. Hugo's commitment to social justice, his opposition to capital punishment, and his belief in the power of literature to promote moral and social reform resonated with Leo's own developing convictions. The meeting with Hugo reinforced Leo's sense that literature should serve a moral purpose, and that writers had a responsibility to use their talents in the service of human betterment. Perhaps most importantly, the second European journey provided Leo with the opportunity to read Hugo's newly completed masterpiece, Les Misérables, before its publication. This epic novel, with its sweeping portrayal of French society and its passionate advocacy for the poor and oppressed, made a profound impression on Leo and influenced his own approach to the novel as a literary form. Hugo's ability to combine detailed social observation with moral passion, and his success in creating characters who embodied both individual psychology and social forces, provided Leo with a model for his own literary ambitions. The European journeys also deepened Leo's understanding of the social and political questions that were transforming European society in the mid-19th century. This was the era of rapid industrialization, urbanization, and social change, when traditional ways of life were being disrupted by new economic forces and new ideas about human rights and social organization. Leo observed the growing gap between rich and poor in European cities, the harsh conditions of industrial workers, and the social tensions that were beginning to challenge the stability of European governments. These observations reinforced Leo's growing conviction that there was something fundamentally wrong with the direction of European civilization. While he admired many aspects of European culture and learning, he was troubled by what he saw as the moral and spiritual costs of material progress. The contrast between the cultural achievements of European civilization and the social problems it had created contributed to his growing skepticism about the value of progress as it was conventionally understood. The European journeys also provided Leo with a broader perspective on Russian society and its problems. Viewing Russia from the outside, he was able to see both its strengths and weaknesses more clearly. He was struck by the vitality and authenticity of Russian peasant culture compared to what he perceived as the artificiality and corruption of European urban civilization. At the same time, he was acutely aware of the backwardness and injustice of Russian social institutions, particularly the system of serfdom that still bound millions of peasants to their noble masters. When Leo returned to Russia in 1861, he brought with him a wealth of new experiences and ideas that would profoundly influence his subsequent development as a writer and social reformer. The European journeys had exposed him to new ways of thinking about education, literature, and society, while also deepening his appreciation for the unique qualities of Russian culture and the Russian people. Most importantly, They had crystallized his growing conviction that he had a moral obligation to use his talents and privileges in the service of human betterment. The impact of the European journeys can be seen in the educational experiments that Leo undertook at Yasnaya Poliana upon his return. Drawing on the pedagogical methods he had observed in Europe, he established a school for peasant children that was revolutionary in its approach to education. The school emphasized the natural development of the child, rejected corporal punishment and authoritarian methods, and sought to integrate intellectual, practical, and moral education in ways that were unprecedented in Russian education. The European journeys also influenced Leo's approach to literature and his growing sense that writing should serve a moral and social purpose. The exposure to European literary culture and the encounter with writers like Hugo had reinforced his belief that literature could be a powerful force for social change and moral enlightenment. This conviction would inform all of his subsequent literary work and would eventually lead him to develop a theory of art that emphasized its moral and spiritual functions rather than its aesthetic qualities. Perhaps most importantly, the European journeys had deepened Leo's understanding of the moral questions that would dominate his later life. The witness to state violence in Paris, the exposure to social injustice in European cities, and the encounter with new ideas about human rights and social organization had all contributed to his growing sense that fundamental changes were needed in the way human societies were organized. The seeds of his later radicalism and his rejection of conventional social institutions had been planted during these formative journeys to Western Europe. When Leo settled into married life at Yasnaya Poliana in 1862, he brought with him not only a wealth of new experiences and ideas, but also a deepened sense of moral purpose and social responsibility. The European journeys had transformed him from a talented but somewhat aimless young writer into a serious artist and social thinker who was committed to using his gifts in the service of human betterment. The stage was set for the most productive period of his literary career, during which he would create the masterpieces that would establish his reputation as one of the world's greatest writers. The year 1862 marked a profound transformation in Leo Tolstoy's personal life that would provide the stability and emotional foundation necessary for his greatest literary achievements. On September 23rd, he married Sofia Andreevna Bez, the 18-year-old daughter of a Moscow court physician. Sofia, known to her family and friends as Sonia, was intelligent, well-educated, and deeply devoted to Leo, despite the 16-year age difference between them. The marriage, which would last for 48 years until Leo's death, was passionate, tumultuous, and ultimately central to both his personal happiness and his literary productivity. The early years of the marriage were marked by intense happiness and creative fertility. Sonia proved to be not only a loving wife, but also an invaluable literary collaborator, serving as Leo's copyist, editor, and critic. She would painstakingly transcribe his handwritten manuscripts, often deciphering his notoriously difficult handwriting and making suggestions for improvements. Her dedication to his work was extraordinary. She would copy War and Peace 7 times by hand, and her contributions to the editing and revision process were essential to the final form of his masterpieces. The domestic happiness that Leo found in his marriage provided him with the emotional stability he had long sought. The chaos and moral confusion of his bachelor years gave way to a more settled existence centered on family life and literary work. Yasnaya Poliana became not just a home but a creative sanctuary where Leo could pursue his artistic vision without the distractions and temptations that had previously undermined his efforts. The estate, with its peaceful rural setting and its connection to the rhythms of agricultural life, provided the perfect environment for the kind of sustained creative work that his literary ambitions required. It was in this context of personal happiness and domestic stability that Leo began work on the novel that would establish his reputation as one of the world's greatest writers. War and Peace, begun in 1863 and completed in 1869, was conceived on a scale that was unprecedented in Russian literature and that challenged conventional notions of what a novel could be. The work was simultaneously a historical epic, a philosophical meditation, a family saga, and a profound exploration of the forces that shape human destiny. The genesis of War and Peace can be traced to Leo's long-standing interest in the Napoleonic era and its impact on Russian society. The War of 1812, in which Napoleon's Grande Armée invaded Russia, only to be destroyed by the combination of Russian resistance and the brutal winter, was the defining event of his father's generation and had shaped the consciousness of the Russian nobility throughout Leo's childhood. The war represented not only a military victory, but a moment of national awakening that had profound implications for Russian identity and Russia's relationship with Western Europe. Leo's approach to this historical material was revolutionary in its scope and ambition. Rather than focusing on the great political and military leaders who had traditionally been the subjects of historical novels, he chose to explore the war through the experiences of ordinary people, nobles and peasants, soldiers and civilians, whose lives were shaped by forces beyond their control. This democratic approach to historical narrative reflected his growing conviction that history was made not by great men, but by the collective actions of ordinary people responding to circumstances they only partially understood. The novel's structure was as innovative as its approach to historical material. Leo rejected the conventional plot-driven narrative in favor of a vast, sprawling work that followed multiple characters and storylines across a period of 15 years. The novel included detailed battle scenes, intimate family dramas, philosophical discussions, and social observations that together created a comprehensive portrait of Russian society during one of the most crucial periods in its history. The work was so large and complex that it challenged traditional definitions of the novel as a literary form. Central to War and Peace was Leo's exploration of the relationship between individual will and historical necessity. Through characters like Pierre Bezukhov, Prince Andrei Bolkonsky, and Natasha Rostova, he examined how people attempt to find meaning and purpose in a world that often seems chaotic and incomprehensible. The novel's famous epilogue, which includes extensive philosophical discussions about the nature of history and causation, reflected Leo's conviction that traditional approaches to understanding historical events were fundamentally flawed. Leo's portrayal of Napoleon and other historical figures was deliberately iconoclastic, presenting them not as heroic leaders who shaped events through their genius and will, but as individuals who were themselves shaped by forces beyond their control. This approach reflected his growing skepticism about the role of great men in history, and his belief that historical events resulted from the complex interaction of countless individual decisions and circumstances rather than from the plans and intentions of political and military leaders. The novel's treatment of war itself was equally revolutionary. Drawing on his own experiences in the Crimean War, Leo portrayed battle not as a realm of heroic action and noble sacrifice, but as a chaotic and often meaningless experience in which individual courage and cowardice, wisdom and folly, were largely irrelevant to the ultimate outcome. His battle scenes, particularly the famous description of the Battle of Borodino, were remarkable for their psychological realism and their refusal to romanticize or glorify warfare. The publication of War and Peace in serial form between 1865 and 1869 created a sensation in Russian literary circles and established Leo as the leading novelist of his generation. Critics and readers were amazed by the scope and ambition of the work, its psychological insight and its philosophical depth. The novel was recognized as something entirely new in Russian literature, a work that combined the social realism of writers like Ivan Turgenev with the philosophical ambition of European masters like Goethe and Balzac. The success of War and Peace brought Tolstoy international recognition and established his reputation beyond Russia. The novel was quickly translated into other European languages and was recognized by critics and writers throughout Europe as a masterpiece of world literature. The work's combination of historical scope, psychological insight, and philosophical depth set a new standard for the novel as a literary form and influenced writers throughout Europe and America. However, even as Leo was enjoying the success of War and Peace, he was already beginning work on another novel that would prove to be equally significant. Anna Karenina, begun in 1873 and completed in 1878, represented a different kind of achievement, focusing on contemporary Russian society rather than historical events and exploring themes of love, marriage, and social change that were of immediate relevance to his readers. The inspiration for Anna Karenina came from a variety of sources, including Leo's observations of contemporary Russian society and his growing interest in the moral and social questions raised by the rapid changes that were transforming Russia in the post-emancipation era. The abolition of serfdom in 1861 had unleashed forces of social and economic change that were reshaping Russian society in fundamental ways, creating new opportunities and new problems that demanded literary exploration. The novel's central story, the tragic love affair between Anna Karenina and Count Vronsky, was based in part on a real incident that had occurred near Yasnaya Polyana, where a woman had committed suicide by throwing herself under a train. However, Leo transformed this simple incident into a complex exploration of love, passion, social convention, and moral responsibility that revealed the tensions and contradictions of contemporary Russian society. The structure of Anna Karenina was more conventional than that of War and Peace, following two parallel storylines that explored different approaches to the questions of love and marriage. The tragic story of Anna's adultery and its consequences was balanced by the more hopeful story of Konstantin Levin's search for meaning and purpose in rural life. Through these contrasting narratives, Leo was able to explore the full range of possibilities and problems that faced individuals in contemporary Russian society. The character of Konstantin Levin was clearly based on Leo himself, and through Levin's experiences and reflections, the novel explored many of the questions that were troubling Leo during this period of his life. Levin's struggles with faith and doubt, his attempts to find meaning in agricultural work and family life, and his growing sense of social responsibility all reflected Leo's own spiritual and intellectual development during the 1870s. The novel's treatment of contemporary social issues was more direct and explicit than that of War and Peace. Through the various characters and their experiences, Leo explored questions about women's rights, the changing nature of marriage and family life, the impact of modernization on traditional ways of life, and the growing gap between the educated classes and the common people. The novel served as both a mirror of contemporary Russian society and a critique of its values and institutions. The famous opening line of Anna Karenina, "All happy families are alike. Each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way," established the novel's focus on the complexities and contradictions of family life in a changing society. Through the various families portrayed in the novel, Leo explored how social change was affecting the most intimate aspects of human experience, and how individuals were struggling to adapt to new circumstances and new possibilities. The novel's treatment of Anna herself was both sympathetic and morally complex. While Leo clearly condemned adultery as a violation of moral law, he also portrayed Anna as a victim of social conventions that denied women the same freedoms and opportunities that were available to men. Anna's tragedy was not simply the result of her moral failings, but also of a society that offered women few alternatives to unsatisfying marriages, and that punished them severely for seeking happiness outside the bounds of social convention. The publication of Anna Karenina confirmed Leo's position as Russia's greatest living novelist and established him as one of the major figures in world literature. The novel was praised for its psychological insight, its social realism, and its moral seriousness, and it was recognized as a worthy successor to War and Peace. Critics noted the novel's more focused structure and its more direct engagement with contemporary issues, while also praising its continued demonstration of Leo's unparalleled ability to create complex, believable characters and to explore the deepest questions of human existence. The success of both War and Peace and Anna Karenina established Leo as not only a great Russian writer, but as a figure of international significance whose work spoke to universal human concerns. The novels were translated into numerous languages and were read and admired throughout Europe and America. Leo's reputation as a literary genius was secure, and he was widely regarded as one of the greatest novelists who had ever lived. However, even as Leo was enjoying the pinnacle of his literary success, he was beginning to experience the spiritual crisis that would transform his life and work in the years to come. The completion of Anna Karenina marked the end of one phase of his career and the beginning of another, as he began to question not only the value of his literary achievements, but the entire foundation of his existence. The man who had created two of the world's greatest novels was about to embark on a spiritual journey that would lead him to reject much of what he had previously valued and to seek a completely different kind of meaning and purpose in life. The period from 1862 to 1878 represented the height of Leo Tolstoy's achievement as a novelist and established his reputation as one of the greatest writers in world literature. The domestic happiness he found in his marriage to Sonia provided the stability and support necessary for his creative work, while his deep engagement with the moral and social questions of his time gave his novels their philosophical depth and universal appeal. War and Peace and Anna Karenina remain among the greatest achievements in the history of the novel, works that continue to be read and admired more than a century after their creation. Yet even as Leo was creating these masterpieces, the seeds of his later spiritual transformation were already being planted, preparing the ground for the dramatic changes that would reshape his life and work in the years to come. The completion of Anna Karenina in 1878 should have marked the pinnacle of Leo Tolstoy's satisfaction and achievement. At 50 years of age, he had created two of the world's greatest novels, established himself as Russia's preeminent writer, and achieved international recognition as a literary genius. His family life was stable and fulfilling, with Sonia having borne him numerous children who brought joy and meaning to his domestic existence. His financial situation was secure, his estates were prosperous, and his position in Russian society was unassailable. By any conventional measure, Leo Tolstoy had achieved everything that a man of his background and talents could reasonably hope to accomplish. Yet it was precisely at this moment of apparent triumph that Leo began to experience the most profound crisis of his life. The spiritual and existential questions that had troubled him since his youth, temporarily quieted by the demands of literary creation and family responsibilities, returned with overwhelming force. The success of his novels, rather than providing lasting satisfaction, seemed to highlight the ultimate meaninglessness of artistic achievement in the face of mortality, and the apparent purposelessness of existence. The comfortable life he had built for himself and his family began to feel like an elaborate deception, a way of avoiding the fundamental questions about the meaning and purpose of human life. This crisis was not merely intellectual, but deeply personal and emotional. Leo found himself overwhelmed by a sense of despair and emptiness that no external achievement could fill. He began to question everything he had previously valued: his literary work, his family relationships, his social position, and even his will to live. The depression that engulfed him was so severe that he seriously considered suicide, and he later wrote that he had to hide ropes and guns from himself to prevent impulsive acts of self-destruction. The intensity of Leo's spiritual crisis was captured in his autobiographical work Confession, written between 1879 and 1882 which documented his journey from despair to faith with unflinching honesty. In this remarkable work, he described how the apparent meaninglessness of life had become unbearable to him, despite all his worldly success. He wrote of feeling like a man lost in a forest, unable to find his way, and increasingly desperate as darkness approached. The conventional answers provided by philosophy, science, and culture seemed inadequate to address the fundamental questions that tormented him. Leo's search for meaning led him to examine the lives and beliefs of the common people, particularly the Russian peasants who worked his estates. He was struck by the fact that these simple, uneducated people seemed to possess a peace and certainty that eluded him, despite all his learning and sophistication. They faced the same fundamental realities of suffering and death that troubled him, yet they seemed to find in their religious faith a source of strength and meaning that enabled them to endure their hardships with dignity and even joy. This observation led Leo to a serious study of religion, not as an intellectual exercise but as a desperate search for answers to the questions that were destroying his peace of mind. He began with an examination of Orthodox Christianity, the faith of his childhood and of the Russian people, but he found himself unable to accept many of its doctrines and practices. The elaborate rituals, the emphasis on supernatural beliefs, and the Church's alliance with the autocratic state all seemed to him to obscure rather than illuminate the essential truths of religious faith. Leo's religious searching was not limited to Christianity, but extended to other world religions and philosophical systems. He studied Buddhism, Islam, and various forms of Eastern philosophy, seeking universal truths that might transcend the particular doctrines of any single tradition. This comparative approach to religion was unusual for his time and place, and it reflected his conviction that truth could not be the exclusive possession of any one culture or tradition. The breakthrough in Leo's spiritual crisis came through his encounter with the teachings of Jesus, particularly the Sermon on the Mount, which he came to regard as the most perfect expression of moral truth ever articulated. However, his interpretation of Jesus' teachings was highly personal and often at odds with conventional Christian doctrine. He focused on what he saw as the essential ethical teachings: love of enemies, non-resistance to evil, and the rejection of violence, while dismissing much of the supernatural and theological content of Christianity as later additions that obscured the original message. Leo's literal interpretation of Jesus' commandment to resist not evil became the cornerstone of his new philosophy. He came to believe that all violence, whether individual or institutional, was morally wrong, and that true Christians were called to reject all forms of coercion and force. This principle led him to reject not only war and capital punishment, but also the entire apparatus of government, which he saw as fundamentally based on violence and coercion. The development of Leo's Christian anarchist philosophy was gradual but inexorable. He came to see the state as an institution that corrupted both rulers and ruled, creating artificial distinctions between people and justifying the use of violence in the name of order and justice. He rejected the idea that some people had the right to rule over others, and came to believe that true Christianity required the complete rejection of all forms of authority, except the moral authority of conscience guided by divine truth. This philosophical transformation had profound implications for Leo's personal life and his relationship with his family and society. He began to feel that his comfortable lifestyle was morally indefensible, built as it was on the labor of others, and maintained through his participation in an unjust social system. He attempted to simplify his life, taking up manual labor and trying to live more like the peasants whose wisdom he had come to admire. He also began to question the value of his literary work, wondering whether the creation of novels was a worthy use of his time and talents when there was so much suffering in the world. Leo's spiritual transformation created enormous tensions within his family, particularly with Sonia, who had devoted her life to supporting his literary career and maintaining their comfortable domestic existence. She was bewildered and frightened by his rejection of the values and lifestyle that had defined their marriage, and she feared that his new beliefs would destroy everything they had built together. The conflict between Leo's spiritual convictions and his family obligations would become a source of ongoing anguish for both of them. The practical implications of Leo's new philosophy extended beyond his personal life to his role as a landowner and member of the Russian nobility. He began to question his right to own land and to benefit from the labor of others, and he made various attempts to redistribute his wealth and property. However, these efforts were complicated by legal restrictions and family opposition, and Leo found himself trapped between his moral convictions and his practical circumstances. Leo's spiritual transformation also led to a fundamental change in his approach to literature and art. He came to believe that art should serve a moral purpose and should be accessible to all people, not just the educated elite. This led him to reject much of his earlier work, including War and Peace and Anna Karenina, as self-indulgent exercises that serve no useful moral purpose. He began to write simpler stories and moral tales that were designed to teach ethical lessons, rather than to display literary virtuosity. The publication of The Kingdom of God is Within You in 1894 marked the full articulation of Leo's mature philosophy. This work, which was banned in Russia but widely circulated in Western Europe and America, presented his theory of non-violent resistance and his critique of all forms of institutional authority. The book had a profound influence on later advocates of non-violent social change, including Mahatma Gandhi, who acknowledged Leo as one of his most important intellectual influences. Leo's correspondence with Gandhi, which began in 1909, represented one of the most significant intellectual exchanges of the modern era. Gandhi had read Leo's works on non-violence and had been inspired by his example to develop his own philosophy of satyagraha or truth force. The two men shared a commitment to non-violent resistance and a belief that moral transformation was more important than political change. Their correspondence helped to establish the intellectual foundation for the non-violent movements that would transform the 20th century. The influence of Leo's spiritual and political philosophy extended far beyond his correspondence with individual leaders to inspire movements for social change around the world. His writings on non-violence were studied by activists in many countries, and his example of moral courage in the face of social pressure provided inspiration for those who sought to challenge unjust systems through peaceful means. However, Leo's transformation also came at a considerable personal cost. His rejection of conventional values and his criticism of established institutions made him a controversial figure who was viewed with suspicion by both government authorities and church leaders. In 1901, the Russian Orthodox Church formally excommunicated him, declaring his teachings to be incompatible with Christian doctrine. This action, while painful to Leo personally, only confirmed his conviction that organized religion had strayed from the true teachings of Jesus. The final decades of Leo's life were marked by ongoing struggles to live according to his convictions, while managing the practical demands of family life and social responsibility. He continued to write prolifically, producing works that reflected his mature philosophy and his commitment to moral and spiritual truth. His later stories, such as The Death of Ivan Ilyich and The Kreutzer Sonata, explored themes of mortality, spiritual awakening, and the search for authentic existence with a depth and intensity that reflected his own spiritual journey. The last decade of Leo Tolstoy's life was marked by increasing tension between his spiritual convictions and his practical circumstances, a conflict that would ultimately drive him to make the dramatic gesture that defined his final days. As he entered his 70s, Leo became increasingly troubled by what he saw as the contradiction between his teachings about simple living and non-violence and his continued existence as a wealthy landowner surrounded by the comforts of aristocratic life. The conflict with his family, particularly with Sonia, had intensified over the years as Leo's commitment to his radical philosophy deepened. Sonia, who had devoted her life to supporting his literary career and maintaining their family's social position, was devastated by his rejection of the values that had defined their marriage. She feared that his plans to give away their property would leave their children impoverished, and that his increasingly radical views would destroy their family's reputation and security. The tension reached a breaking point in 1910, when Leo, at the age of 82, made the decision to leave Yasnaya Polyana and his family to live as a simple wanderer in accordance with his beliefs. On the night of October 28, 1910, he secretly left the estate with his doctor and youngest daughter, intending to find a place where he could live, according to his convictions, without the complications and compromises that his family situation imposed. However, Leo's health, which had been declining for several years, could not withstand the stress and exposure of his journey. He became ill during the train journey and was forced to stop at the small railway station of Astapovo, where he was taken to the station master's house. News of his illness quickly spread, and Astapovo became the focus of international attention as reporters, government officials, and family members gathered to await news of the great writer's condition. Leo Tolstoy died at Astapovo on November 20, 1910, surrounded by family members and followers, but still estranged from Sonia, who was not permitted to see him until his final moments. His death marked the end of one of the most extraordinary lives in the history of literature and moral philosophy, a life that had encompassed the creation of immortal works of art and a radical transformation of personal values that influenced movements for social change around the world. The funeral of Leo Tolstoy became a demonstration of the profound impact he had had on Russian society and world culture. Thousands of people, from peasants to intellectuals, gathered to pay their respects to the man who had given voice to their deepest aspirations and concerns. The government, which had viewed Leo with suspicion during his lifetime, was forced to acknowledge his significance, while the Orthodox Church, which had excommunicated him, struggled to respond to the outpouring of popular grief and admiration. Leo's legacy was complex and multifaceted, encompassing both his literary achievements and his moral and political philosophy. As a writer, he had created works that were universally recognized as among the greatest achievements in world literature. War and Peace and Anna Karenina continue to be read and admired by readers around the world, while his shorter works and moral tales provided inspiration for those seeking to understand the deeper questions of human existence. As a moral philosopher and social critic, Leo's influence was equally profound. His theory of nonviolent resistance provided the intellectual foundation for movements that would transform the 20th century, from Gandhi's struggle for Indian independence to the American civil rights movement led by Martin Luther King Jr. His critique of state power and institutional authority influenced anarchist and pacifist movements around the world, while his emphasis on simple living and moral authenticity inspired countless individuals to examine their own lives and values. The estate of Yasnaya Polyana, which Leo had tried to leave behind in his final days, became a shrine to his memory and a symbol of his enduring influence. The house and grounds were preserved as they had been during his lifetime, and the estate became a museum that attracted visitors from around the world who came to understand the environment that had shaped one of history's greatest writers and moral teachers. Perhaps most importantly, Leo Tolstoy's life and work demonstrated the possibility of radical personal transformation and moral growth. His journey from dissolute young aristocrat to literary genius to spiritual revolutionary showed that individuals could transcend the limitations of their background and circumstances to achieve authentic moral and spiritual development. His example provided inspiration for those who sought to live according to their deepest convictions, regardless of the personal cost or social pressure they might face. The questions that Leo Tolstoy grappled with throughout his life: how should we live? What is the meaning of existence? How can we create a just society, remain as relevant today as they were in his time? His answers to these questions, while not universally accepted, continue to challenge and inspire those who seek to understand the deeper purposes of human life. In an age of increasing materialism and moral confusion, Leo Tolstoy's example of moral courage and spiritual searching provides a powerful reminder of the human capacity for growth, transformation, and authentic existence, The life of Leo Tolstoy was ultimately a testament to the power of literature and moral philosophy to transform both individual lives and entire societies. Through his novels, he revealed the complexity and beauty of human existence while exposing the injustices and contradictions of his society. Through his spiritual journey, he demonstrated the possibility of radical moral transformation and provided a model for those who sought to live according to their deepest convictions. His legacy continues to inspire writers, activists, and ordinary individuals who seek to understand the deeper meanings of life and to work for a more just and compassionate world. In the end, Leo Tolstoy's greatest achievement may have been his demonstration that a single individual, through the power of moral conviction and artistic genius, could influence the course of human history. His life reminds us that literature and moral philosophy are not merely academic exercises, but powerful forces that can reshape our understanding of ourselves and our world. In an age that often seems dominated by cynicism and despair, Leo Tolstoy's example of hope, courage, and moral commitment continues to provide inspiration for all who seek to make their lives meaningful and their world more just.